Yeah. So we're talking about discussion 3 of the incoherence of the philosophers, the Tahafut, the Falasifa. And in that discussion, Ghazali, right, says, like I said, he says that the philosopher say that they think that God is the agent and the maker of the world, but they don't really, their philosophy or their system of thinking doesn't actually cohere with that claim. It's not possible for them to really think so because of 3 reasons, and they have to do with the nature of the agent, he says, the nature of the act, and the nature of the relation between the agent and the act. So in the last part, we talked about his argument against them with regard to the nature of the agent. Yeah? And he was saying there that the agent is not just any cause, but a cause that causes by will and choice. And the philosophers, he claims, don't believe that God causes the world by choice, but rather by sort of natural result, right? The way that the light comes from the sun, or so, and the shadow comes from a person, that kind of thing. Yeah. And so we already talked about the arguments between them regarding that, whether that word agent really means what he claims, and whether it matters what the word means, right? Whether what the reality of the case is a separate situation from just whatever the word means, and so forth. Yeah. So some of the things that we discussed also when we brought in Ibn Rushd's defense of the philosophers of this, Ibn Rushd is claiming, no, the philosophers don't claim that God doesn't have a will. They just claim that God doesn't have a will like people, right? He says the empirical agent that we see in the world, and he says that agent is just a kind of cause, but in a different sense than what Ghazali defined. For Ghazali, the agent was a cause that causes by will, but for Ibn Rushd, the agent is a special kind of cause. It's a cause, a cause is an agent just in case it causes the existence of something else distinct from itself. Right? So remember there were the 4 kinds of causes, and it was the formal cause, the material cause, the final cause, and the efficient cause. The agent is the efficient cause on that system of thinking. The thing which causes the existence of something or brings something about which is different from itself. Right? So the form of a thing is one of its causes, but the form of a thing is not different from that thing itself. Yeah? So that means if we said that God, for example, was the formal cause of the world, we would be saying that God is like the form of the world. That the world and God are the same thing, and actually the God is just kind of an aspect of the world, which would be, right, blasphemy, Or it would be like atheism. So God has to be the agent in the sense that he's the cause of the world, but the world is something that exists distinct from himself. Right? And also Ghazali agrees with that, but he thinks that agent also specifically means the cause which causes by will and choice. And Ibn Rushd says that's not possible for God because God's timeless. Right? He basically says that when, and he's perfect, God's perfect, so God doesn't lack anything. Ibn Rushd says when somebody chooses, it's because they are lacking something and they're choosing what they need, right? But God doesn't lack anything, so he doesn't make a choice. And when somebody chooses, once they get what they chose or what they willed, their will stops. They change. They don't will that anymore. They don't want that anymore. So that's a change, but God doesn't change. So these are the reasons why Ibn Rushd says God doesn't have a will in the sense that we human beings have a will, right? It's because that entails his imperfection and his change, right? That human beings have. That willing actually entails that. So he's sort of giving reasons why Ghazali is wrong about God having a will, but then at the same time he turns around and says, well, God does have a will, but it's not like human beings, right? And we already had discussed Ghazali himself already agrees, of course, that God's will is not like people, and that God is not like human beings or anything created in just those same ways. He's perfect, he doesn't change, right? Ghazali's idea of will is that it's a capacity to select between 2 identical possible scenarios. Like 2 different scenarios which are equal with regard to any potential good that they could bring about, right? So if you were to, for example, consider different possible ways God could have made the world different than it is, yeah? Ghazali says there are ways the world could have been different than it is, which would have been just as good as this world. So, in that case, there's no reason that can be given. There's no rational reason that can be given why God made the world this way rather than another. Just that there were these two options, and one of them had to be realized in order for the world to exist instead of the other one, right? And that means that the cause of the world, the agent of the world, has to have the capacity to select one among the multiple options when there's actually no reason why one among or another should be chosen. Okay? So that was his view of will, and so in a certain sense, Ibn Rushd is a little bit kind of talking at cross purposes. He's thinking or assuming that Ghazali is understanding will just purely by analogy to human will. Right? But the real issue seems to boil down to whether or not there actually are multiple ways the world could have been, which are equally optimal, right? Or whether there's only one best possible way the world could be, and this is the one it is. And all this follows from the premise that God is perfect, and so He would not create less optimal than He could. He would not create the worst world than He could possibly create. It's like, since He's perfect, He will create the best world that He could possibly create. Now, if there's only one best possible world, then it's easy to say, well, everything that God has done and chosen and everything about the world is the way that it must be and cannot be otherwise, and there's a complete explanation for all of it, right? But if there were more than one way that the world could have been, which are equally good, and they're both equally the best possible ways, then there's that issue of why is this one rather than the other one? And Ghazali is basically arguing that God has will, because will is the ability to choose between two completely equal options. Like in the analogy that they give, there's a man in the desert, or he's hungry and there's 2 dates, or he's thirsty and there's 2 glasses of water, and both of them are exactly the same. They have the same amount of water, and both of them are the same distance from his hand, right? And there's no reason in the situation you could possibly give to explain why he picks one rather than the other. And Ghazali says, well, he can pick one because the other option is to go hungry or thirsty. He will pick one even though there's no reason for picking one instead of another one, and that's because he has will, right? So we have will and knowledge and power, right? And we need to postulate the faculty of will in order to explain that things can be chosen out of equivalent options, equivalent alternatives. In the case of the people, and also, of course, in the case of God, because there are many different possible ways the world could have been, and one of them rather than others are the way it is. Okay. So, the second, and that's just review, right? So the second thing is action, the act, right? Ghazali says, with regard to the act, also they cannot believe that God's the agent, because if God's the agent of the world must be His act. And an act, he says, is by definition something that comes to be, right? But the philosopher believes that the world is pre-eternal and has always existed. And that which already exists cannot come to exist, right? And the third thing, which is much more complicated, and I'm not really sure if I'm deciding whether to try to cover that in class, was this question about the fact that only from one can come, right? That will come later. Yeah. But right now we're going to talk about the act. Ghazali says that action is bringing forth of the thing from non-existence to existence by creating it. Yeah? But the pre-eternal, what has always existed from eternity, always already exists. And so you can't bring into existence that which already exists. So the philosopher who say the world is a pre-eternal cannot really think that the world is God's act, right? Even though they say so. So then Ghazali considers this response from the philosopher, which is that, as I kind of tried to lay out here in a stepwise fashion. Creation, we start with this idea that, well, the whole gist of the argument is that creation compromises the agent, right? The idea of creation compromises the relation that the agent must have to the act, yeah? If we understand it correctly. So if we start with the idea of being created that Ghazali himself is holding, right? To be created means to exist after non-existence. It means that it didn't exist and then it became to exist, right? If there was no prior or previous non-existence, right, but the thing has always existed, it cannot be created because it's already there, always, right? So that's what creation means, to come to exist after non-existence. Now, it's kind of that'll get a little bit subtle, but it's more simple than it sounds, right? So we'll go slow here. Right? They say the agent relates either to the existence or the non-existence of its object or its act, right? So there's the agent, the thing that brings the thing into existence, and there's the object, the thing that it brings into existence. And there's got to be this relation between the two in order for the agent to be bringing the act into existence, or to be bringing the object into existence, right? Now, if a thing has existence, right, and it has non-existence, I mean, we can think of these things in relation to it, right? Obviously, if it's created, then there's a previous time in which it didn't exist, and then it does exist. And when we say that the agent brings the act into our existence, or is bringing existence to it, what is it related to? To what is the agent related? Is it related to the object in as much as the object exists, its existence? Or is it related to the object's non-existence, right? Well, the answer is pretty clear, because non-existence isn't the thing that you can relate to, right? When an agent brings something to be, or when it makes something, right, it's related to the existent. It's not related to non-existence. Non-existence isn't something. You don't need an agent for non-existence, right, because it doesn't exist. Non-existence doesn't need a cause, because it's just not there. It's not something that needs to be caused, right? Only the existent needs a cause. So, non-existence is not something to be related to. Part of the key in this argument here, and one of the core philosophical problems is this idea. Sorry. Just this idea that non-existence is not something, which goes back to, if you remember from Introduction to Philosophy class, back to the pre-Socratic philosophers and Parmenides, right, who was credited for being the first one to come up with this nugget of wisdom. Non-existence is, but the nothing is not something, right? Yeah, and from that you get this problem about how can something come to be, because, or basically for change to occur, is for nothing to become something, or for what's not to be, or for what is to be not, and this is a contradiction. But we had talked about that before. This is going on here, right? So, since non-existence is not something, we can't say that the agent relates to the thing's non-existence, right? It only relates to the existence of its object. And then they basically infer that if the object is eternal, right? We say if the thing that's made is eternal, that would mean that the relation between the agent and that thing is eternal, right? Yeah. Or the relation is eternal, then that means the agent is eternally bringing it into existence. Okay? So you have an eternal agent. Yeah? The agent is eternally an agent. It's eternally bringing the thing into existence, and that makes it more of an agent than not, right? So they're basically saying, look, our understanding is that God is continually giving the world existence, and is giving the world existence for eternity, right? And that's the only way, I mean, you can think of it, because God's not related to the non-existence of the world. It's only related to the existence. So if God is eternal, right, and He is always the agent, He will eternally be the agent, and the thing, the object, in this case the world, which He's bringing existence to, He will be eternally giving it existence, and it will be, therefore, be eternal, right? On the other hand, they say, if you're going to say that the object is related to the agent, Not in as much as it's non-existent, because of course that doesn't make sense. Non-existence doesn't relate, right? But not that it's only its existence that's related, but it's related in as much as it is an existent after non-existent. Yeah? So, and this is what Ghazali ends up saying. They're preempting him here because they know what's going to happen. And he knows that's what they're doing. He's the one giving the argument, right? Yeah? So, the idea is, okay, you might respond to us that, no, God doesn't relate to the world in as much as it's existing. He relates to the world in as much as it comes to be, in as much as it's a creation. Because to be the agent is to create the thing, to bring it into being and to bring it into existence after its previous non-existence. Not just its existence, but its creation. Yeah? And that means basically that, as Ghazali was saying, if it is going to actually be an act, its having previously not existed is a condition of being an act, because that's what an act is. If it has always existed, then it's not an act. It's just always there, right? So that means that if the act is related to the agent as an act, it has to be related to the agent by virtue of not just its existing, but by virtue of its existing after not existing. Yeah? It existing in a special way, not just any existence. Yeah? But its preceding existence, as we already said, it's not an effect of the agent. The agent, God is not the creator of the non-existence of the world, right? He's creating the existence of the world. The non-existence of the world doesn't need to be created, right? But now we have it that in order for the world to be a creation, it must have this previous non-existence, because that's what it makes an act an act. That's what makes creation creation, right? It can't be a creation if it doesn't have this previous non-existence. So this non-existence is now a kind of a necessary condition or a requirement that it must be in place in order for it to be the act of the agent, right? And yet that condition, that requirement, which is again the previous non-existence, is not something that the agent itself affects or has any relation to or power over, right? So the argument is, if you say that the act has to be created, right, given your definition of creation, then that means the act is not really within the power of the agent. The agent is not sufficient for the act, right? Why again? Because it can't be an act without a previous non-existence. But the previous non-existence is not something that the agent does, because non-existence is not something created. It's not something. Yeah? So now you're basically saying that the agent himself, that's to say God, is not really enough to create the world, because the world also requires, in order to be a creation, this previous non-existence. You need two things. You need God and the previous non-existence, right? So that was their argument, right? So far. Okay, now I know that was a little bit, I went in some circles to try to make that clear. Maybe it just stirred up the water and made it muddy, made it more unclear. It's okay? Stirring up the water is a nice image for us to use, because we're going to come up on that in a minute here, this image of stirring water, right? But, and if I should pause. Is there any question? It's okay?
So the contradiction here is between the eternity and the creation.
Right. Yeah. The eternal existence of something is not a creation, right? Ghazali is saying a thing can't come to be if it already exists. So you can't tell me that you think that God is the agent of the world, right? And the world is his act, when an act is something which comes to be, and you say the world has always existed and never came to be because it's eternal, right? Basically the idea is that an eternal act is a contradiction, because an act is by its very nature something that comes to be after not existing. And now, again, the philosopher, or basically Ibn Sina, is given his argument now. Al-Ghazali is giving or relaying Ibn Sina's argument, right? God is related to existence, not non-existence, right? And he's related to the world as the agent of the world, in as much as the world exists. Yeah? If we to say that he must be related, right, to the world as an act, which is to say an existent after non-existence, we're making its previous non-existence a condition on God's being able to be the agent. And that means God's not himself enough to be the agent. He also needs this previous non-existence. Right? By contrast, he's arguing that no, we say that God is eternally the agent, and in that sense, he's even more so on our theory. But despite what you say on our theory, he's even more so the agent than you guys say, because he's eternally the agent. Right? So we have one side saying, you don't even see he's the agent because the act you claim is already all the time existing already. It's always eternally existing. It doesn't, it doesn't come to be because it always already is. There's no time when it doesn't exist. Right? The other side is saying, our idea of God is that he always is eternally creating the world already. That means he's more perfectly an agent even than what you have on your view. Right? So far, that's the way it goes. Two sides. Everybody understand? Okay. So, then they go on to argue, secondly, that only the existent can be brought into existence. Now that's the thing. Remember, Ghazali said what already exists can't come to exist, because it already exists. The philosopher are going to argue, no, it's the other way around. Only the existent can be brought into existence. Yeah? Because now they have a different idea of being brought into existence, right? Okay. So they say, when you say that what exists cannot be brought into existence, it could mean two things. On the one hand, you could mean that it does not begin to exist after not existing. And in that case, you're correct, because it will already exist then. After non-existence, it already exists, right? And basically, something cannot, the non-being cannot, become something. Yeah. But on the other hand, if you mean that in the state of its existing, in its very condition as an existing thing, it is not something being brought into existence continually, then they say you're wrong. Yeah? In fact, it can only be something brought into existence while it exists, because when it does not exist, it's not something at all. Right? If I'm going to say that before it's not existing, but I'm going to do something with it, I'm going to bring it into existence, it's like, what are you going to do something with? There's nothing there. It doesn't exist. You can't do anything to something that doesn't exist. Right? You can only do something, you can only relate to something which does exist, not which doesn't exist. So the world exists, and God relates to it as the agent, as the giver of existence, and eternally, because God's eternal, and he's eternally the agent, therefore the act must be eternal, right? The world must be eternally existing. Because what we mean in this case by being brought into existence is not something temporal. It doesn't entail that here we have a time before that it doesn't exist and then it does. No, we mean something which is simultaneous with the existence of the thing, not before the existence of the thing, right? So as they say, and here's a little quote here, so maybe we have to sort of piece together some of these big words. The only big word I think is concomitant. That means necessarily together with. Is okay? So bringing into existence is concomitant, right, with the agent's being that which brings about existence, because that's what an agent is, right? And the thing enacted being that which is brought into existence. This is because it is an expression of the relation of the thing that brings about existence to the thing whose existence is brought about. All this obtains with existence, not before it. Okay? So bringing into existence is something that is with the relation between the agent and the act, right? And not something before the agent exists. Not something before the act exists. And not something that is there before the agent is the agent, right? When the agent is the agent, that's when the act exists, because that's when he's the agent, right? And vice versa. So the bringing into existence has to be a relation which is simultaneous, right, and coexistent, concomitant with that whole structure. Yeah? That's why they say all this obtains with existence, not before it. Yeah? So it follows on their view that the world is an eternal act, God the eternal agent, for the relation is with existence. If the relation continues, they say existence continues. If not, existence ceases. Right? Just like, and that's where you got the idea of the light. So if I turn the light on, as long as the light's on, we're seeing things, right? Right? And then if I turn the light off, I don't see, it's dark, right? If we use that analogy for existing and not existing. When I turn the light on, as long as the light's on, things are there. If we turn the light off, things will not be there. But the light and the things being there, the presence of the things in my field of vision, so to speak, it's simultaneous, it's with. Yeah? It's not like I would come in the room, and first I flip the light, right? And then the light goes off, and then all of a sudden things pop out. No, the things are there in the light, with the light. The light lights them up, right? When it's lighting the room. Yeah? And that's why they use this analogy, right? That God's agency and his bringing into existence of things is like that. It's with the world, right? It's with the things that are being brought into it. It's not something before. So therefore they say, it's not as you theologians think, and here's the way Ghazali is sort of portraying the philosopher's view of the theologian's perspective, right? And I think what Ghazali's doing here too is he's also talking to his fellow theologians, his fellow Asharites. Because obviously among people there's different levels of sophistication and understanding, right? And I think Ghazali wants to use the philosopher's arguments not only to bring them out and then give objections to them, but he also wants to use the philosopher's voice that he sort of, when he relays the philosopher's arguments, to kind of give a little bit of critique to the theologians. See what I mean? Like, maybe your view is a little bit simple-minded, and you can step up your game a little bit here, yeah? So, right here is he has them say, it's not like you theologians think that God's relation to the world is like that of a builder to a building, where the builder comes, he puts the building up, and then the builder walks off, and the building is there by itself. Okay, it exists on its own now. The builder did his work, and now the builder's work is over, and the building is basically on its own, right? That is the type of efficient cause which Ibn Sina calls the accidental cause, right? All the builder did was sort of basically bring the materials together, but the house, the existence of the house thereafter, always is still dependent on certain kinds of essential causes that are coexisting with it, right? Right? So it needs its conservation in existence, not just its coming to be. So we have the coming to be of a thing, and then now the idea of its conservation in existence. In the case of the house, the example was used, the sort of substance of the bricks and the materials of the house have to be solid enough, right? They have to have a certain solid enough nature, right? In order to sort of maintain their structure. If you were to try to make a house out of water, it would just, yeah? So there's there's continual causes that have to continually operate in order for the existence of the house to continue, right? And that's not like the builder. The builder is just a one-time cause. He comes and puts everything together and leaves. Then it's done. You don't need to be there anymore. So God's relation to the world in terms of, or the world's dependence on God, is continual, right? Not just a one-time deal where God makes it and then after that it's on its own, right? It's a continual thing. Okay, that's what he's saying. But now, of course, Ghazali agrees with that anyway. But so he's using the voice of the philosophers here who have this view to kind of, point out maybe to some more simple-minded theological views, their limitations. Yeah. So Ghazali responds by saying that the act is related to the agent only in terms of its creation, and not in terms of its previous non-existence, and nor its existence only. So he agrees with the philosopher, he agrees with Ibn Sina. Non-existence is not a thing which God relates to, right? The act is, though, a creation. It's something that exists after not existing. Yeah? And so it's not just the existence of the act that God is related to, It's the coming to be of the act. Its existence after non-existence. He basically agrees, right? That's true. That means that in order to be an act, the non-existence before its existence is a condition of being an act. And that means that in order for God to be the agent of that act, this certain condition has to be met. A condition which God does not make. He doesn't make the non-existence of the world. Right? He doesn't make non-existence. He doesn't make the previous non-existence of the world. So part of what the world needs in order to be a creation is something that God didn't make. No problem, Ghazali says, because there's a lot of conditions for being an agent which have to be met that are not things that the agent creates, right? So for example, God, as the agent of the world, must also have an essence. He must be him, he has to have self. Right? And this is a condition for him being an agent. Right? Also his having power is a condition of his being an agent. And his having will is a condition of his being an agent. And his having the knowledge of what he's going to do and what he's going to make is also a condition of his being an agent. But these things are not effects of God, right? God doesn't create his self or his power or his will or his knowledge. These are all attributes of him which are causes and conditions, right? The thing has to have those, like God has to have those in order to be the maker and the agent of the world. Yeah? So it basically, so your argument doesn't go anywhere. I mean, it basically will agree with it. We'll bite, it's not even biting the bullet. It's no problem. Yeah? The act has to have a previous non-existence to be an act. And God didn't make that. But there's a lot of things that God didn't make that are conditions of his being an agent. Yeah? And that's not an issue. In fact, probably the best argument would be, since this previous non-existence is not something in the first place, as you argue, then how can it be a condition? Because it's not something anyways. Right? But, so, what do you have? The moment, right? The act isn't related to the agent after it already exists. Right? But only at the moment of its origination. Now, so it looks like I mixed up the order of presentation here. Sorry about that. I already told you about the second part. Yeah. The agent is not related to the act is not related to the agent after it already exists, but only at the moment of its origination. Now, why does he say that when Ibn Sina was saying the world depends on God, every moment for its existence? And Ghazali is saying the world is not related to the agent after its existence, but only at the moment that it comes to be. And the reason is because the Ash'arites have a different idea of continuity in time. It's not because Ghazali thinks that the world is independent of God after he makes it. No. They think that everything is continually always dependent on God. But the difference is that the Ash'arites believe that nothing exists for more than a moment anyway. That God creates the thing and